Front-end web UI frameworks are becoming the go-to approach for designing and implementing the recent websites. Let's ask ourselves, what exactly are front-end web UI frameworks, and learn a little more details about them next. So obviously, in this lesson, we're going to ask ourselves, what are front-end web UI frameworks? What do they contain? What are some of the popular front-end web UI frameworks? And why do we need to make use of front-end web UI frameworks when we design our websites? So what are front-end web UI frameworks? Let's take a step backwards and imagine that you only know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you were asked to design a new website, you would obviously go about constructing and implementing the entire website using the technical skills that you have based on your knowledge of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You would often realize that there are many repeated components that you would use on your websites, and you would end up designing your own set of CSS classes. You will be designing some JavaScript-based components, and then once you get a group of these together, every time you need to design a new website, you would be making use of these predefined sets of CSS classes and JavaScript-based components to quickly implement a new website. Why not take this to its logical conclusion? How about if we design an entire framework that consists of ready-to-use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript-based web UI components? So here, a front-end web UI framework may define a bunch of CSS classes that will enable us to include components like buttons, tables, navigation bars, drop-downs, alerts, modals, tabs, accordions, and many more, and quickly enable us to design and implement a website. So this is what a front-end web UI framework accomplishes. It is a collection of all these components. Not only that, it gives you a method of defining consistent typography that you can use for your entire website design, and enables you to quickly scaffold out a web site or a web page. If you search for front-end web frameworks, you would find a plethora of them out there in the internet. Several people have done their own surveys of all these different web UI frameworks and have published their top 10 lists of front-end web UI frameworks. This is one such top 10 list. You may or may not agree with this ranking, but Bootstrap happens to be the most popular among all the front-end web UI frameworks. Bootstrap consistently ranks as the number one in many of the lists of front-end web UI frameworks. The remaining among this list may vary, but you would often find Semantic UI, Foundation by Zerp, Materialize, Material UI, and some of these others appearing in many of those top 10 lists. The next obvious question is, why would you want to use front-end web UI frameworks? First and foremost, they provide you with a consistent way of designing websites. And most of these front-end frameworks support what is called as responsive web design. We will examine more about responsive web design in the next lesson, but quickly summarizing it, you do realize that your website may be accessed from various kinds of devices of different screen sizes, ranging from small mobile phones all the way up to a full-fledged desktop. You want to be able to design your website to automatically adapt itself to cater to the size constraints of each of these different devices from which your website is being accessed. So responsive web design is concerned about this aspect. The second issue that most of these front-end frameworks try to address is cross-browser compatibility. If you have played around with browsers as much as I have done, I'm pretty sure you have come to realize that no two browsers render the same website exactly the same way. So when you design a website to render consistently across many different browsers, you're going to be facing an uphill battle. Now, these front-end frameworks have managed to address most of these idiosyncrasies of the different browsers in such a way that you can deliver consistent rendering of your website on different browsers. So that's the second reason why you may want to resort to using a front-end web UI framework. And the third aspect, of course, is that when you need to design a website, you're always going to be under terrible time pressure. So increasing your productivity so that you don't waste your energy and time on wasteful configuration issues of those individual components of your website. Instead, let that be taken care of by a consistently designed front-end web UI framework. So that saves you a lot of time in terms of implementing your website. And finally, of course, most of these front-end UI frameworks that are out there have their own community, the users that use these web frameworks for implementing websites. So this community of users will provide you with a very efficient way of being able to solve issues that you may encounter when you're applying any one of these frameworks for your website design. So given these different advantages, why would you not want to resort to using a front-end web UI framework? With this understanding about front-end web UI frameworks, let's now proceed forward to learn more about Bootstrap, the most popular front-end web UI framework.